Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it has been absolutely wonderful being involved with Stephen and Anne in the Royal Society of Edinburgh Research Network on the memorialisation of Mary, Queen of Scots. It's been hugely beneficial for me thinking about how we display Mary in the museum currently, and then what we might do in the future. So in March this year, after some protracted negotiations and frantic fundraising, National Museum Scotland acquired the splendid Mary, Queen of Scots casket. Its acquisition and the process that led up to it has prompted a renewed engagement by us at the museum with the objects we hold associated with Mary, and a re-evaluation of their interpretation and display. So today I'm going to consider the National Museum's collecting of such objects in the past, how we might use them to re-present Mary today, and the type of collecting we might plan for the future. The National Collection holds around 900 objects that are associated with Mary. Predominantly, these are the gold and silver coins issued with her image on them during her reign to 1567, which suggests the message of her monarchical I'm sorry, it's quite cold here, which suggests the message of her monarchical power communicated through their exchange in daily life. But perhaps of more popular interest, we have several objects that relate directly to Mary herself, mainly jewellery, and then many others that have been used to commemorate her in the 400 years since her death. The museum's current display, here you can see it in the Renaissance gallery of such items, originates in the interpretation and staging of Mary in the new Museum of Scotland in Chambers Street, Edinburgh, when it opened in 1998. But recent research, such as that by the RSC network into the memorialisation of Mary, has highlighted the affective affordances of objects Mary is thought to have owned or touched, and of the commemorative significance of those created posthumously. In turn, this has driven new ideas for collecting and the narration of Mary's life and afterlife. So today, I'm going to explore the impact of the casket's acquisition on representing Mary here in the museum and in stimulating new types of collecting, in particular, the theatrical costume crown for the title role of the Scottish Ballet's first commissioned work, Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1976. But first, I think we should go back briefly to where it all began, because this impacts on what we have and can do today. Our Scottish collections are built on 2 centuries of collecting, first by the Society of Antiquaries from 1780, then absorbed into the new National Museum of Antiquities in 1851, and much expanded through 19th century efforts to preserve a rapidly disappearing past. By then, the figure of Mary, Queen of Scots, was being increasingly romanticised, depoliticised after the suppression of the Jacobite challenge of the 1700s, and objects associated with her proliferated. Into the 20th century, Mary was an increasingly visible figure in the popular imagination, in films, plays, books, whodunits, which drove an interest in acquisitions related to her. Into the 21st century, there's a much greater interest now in the everyday lives of ordinary people. Yet the fascination with this controversial historical figure seems to continue unabated, and we need to reflect that sense of connection in our museum. The history of such collecting is a reminder that what each generation chooses to collect is conditioned by and a reflection of those times, and the type of objects chosen inevitably changes. Our collections are also especially shaped by the priorities of those curators making those decisions in that moment, and the inclination or capacity of the institution to enable them. Further choices are then made in what goes on display and the narrative woven through them. This means that Mary's meaning, Mary's story, is and should be constantly subject to reinterpretation. Before the casket came into the National Collection, one of our most significant objects relating to Mary were the Pennycook jewels. They are paternoster beads and were probably part of one of the several rosaries Mary is known to have owned, so used for religious devotion. But they had another use too. One of them we found contains probably something like ambergris. So the use of perfume within them to ward off evil smells and disease. This little locket has an image, a miniature portrait of Mary on one side and her son James in a very tall hat on the other. So it's a commemorative piece as well as being something that is believed to have been owned and touched and worn by Mary. They were said to have been given by Mary shortly before her execution to her lady attendant, Gillis Mowbray, from whom they were passed down in the clerks of Pennycook family until the 20th century, revered and preserved as relics of the unfortunate Queen. They came into the museum following a public subscription campaign in the 1920s, indicating, I think, a level of interest in Mary in a decade that also saw the making of the life-size plaster cast of her tomb at Westminster, which sits along beside the Pennycook jewels in the museum. And you can see actually behind me, I'm not really there, but there is Mary's, the monument to Mary and her tomb, and also the displays to my left-hand side containing her jewelry. So I think that remembering that those Pennycook jewels came in by public, partly funded by public subscription is an important point. It indicates that level of interest, that level of engagement, and I think suggests the sort of connections that people viewing those objects feel to this long dead Queen. And and you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen, a close-up actually of that display. The display also contains, as well as the Pennycook jewels, a number of jewels that have been made to commemorate Mary, in particular, two 16th century cameos that possibly were commissioned by Mary to give as presents to her loyal supporters, to remind people of her image in her physical absence, either abroad or at court or ultimately in captivity. But they've been mounted in later centuries. And I think, again, this shows this, this using of objects associated with Mary to commemorate her in the centuries going forward. So on the left here, we have an 18th century ring set with the cameo set quite simply within it. And I think that is within its own elite terms, a fairly everyday object that someone may have worn and touched, and as they did so, to remember Mary. On the right-hand side is a rather more extravagant setting, and it was originally thought to be a Renaissance period setting, but actually recent work by my assistant has uncovered a mold for such a locket in Paris. And so we are now thinking that this actually is a 19th century reimagining of a Renaissance jewel, incorporating, framing the picture of Mary. But the fact that it's given such an elaborate treatment, I think, attests to the significance that person felt Mary represented. To the left of that case of the Pennycook jewels and the other commemorative pieces, we have the Seaton necklace, which is on a very generous long-term loan from the family through whom it has descended into the present day. And I think it's a wonderful expression of the richness of Mary's appearance when she came back from the French court in 1561 back to Scotland. And what we've done here is to use, alongside this, to give it that context, a portrait of Mary done probably around 1558 when she's at the French court by the French painter Francois Clouet. And there you see her swathed in the, the pearls that she's so renowned for, and in the latest fashionable pink Renaissance dress. And I think it's a rather different image to those much more severe images of her in funereal black, in saintly black, of her posthumous portraits that perhaps we associate more readily with Mary. And I think it was important for us to get a sense into the gallery of just what a colourful and impressive figure she must have been. Coming back from this rich French court, riding on her horse, you can imagine her sort of riding up Leith Walk, and Bishop Leslie describes her body covered in costly jewels, unlike anything else in Scotland. We also have tried to bring in different sides of Mary this year in the generous loan of a prayer book, a book of hours, in which Mary has inscribed a very loving poem to her great aunt, her beloved great aunt, Louise de Bourbon, who was Abbess of Fontevraud. And I've actually just recently come back from the Loire Valley, and wherever you go, there are these chateaux there and this abbey where Mary's presence is still felt. She spent much of her married life, her short married life, with Francois in the chateau at Blois, and also at the incredibly romantic chateau of Chenonceau, where a gift to Mary and the Dauphin Francois of an Italian cabinet still stands. But I also then went to Fontevraud, and it was rather amazing to see the setting in which this prayer book, this precious jewel-like prayer book was used, and the multiple images and emblems that Louise de Bourbon emblazoned onto the fabric of the abbey. So you can imagine Mary being with her aunt in this abbey and inscribing the poem that you see here. And this is in the very careful hand of a teenager. She was probably maybe 15 or 16 when she wrote this. So here we have multilingual Mary writing in French, using a Latin motto. And it's a reminder that she lived within that European context and was able to speak multiple languages. We also get an indication of the cleverness, I think, of this little poem, that it manages to express so much in such a pithy and beautiful way. But moving on, this year, of course, has been dominated for us by the acquisition of the casket. And I thought I'd just talk briefly about the main reasons we felt it was such an important acquisition for us at the National Museum. First is its incredible virtuosity as a very rare example of early Renaissance French silver. So it's an incredibly important object in its own right. We haven't found anything similar in any public institution in Europe or America. And if you know of one, please let me know. But it's incredibly rare. And the reason it was made in Paris in between 1490 and around 1506. But the reason it's so rare is that Louis XIV in the later 17th century ordered that most of the silver in France, decorative silver like this, to be melted down to pay for his military campaigns. And it is therefore all the more remarkable that this object survives. It's also incredibly heavy. The main weight you can see is on this heavily encrusted lid, but it also, the decoration extends all around its four sides, but it's incredibly heavy. And I think its heaviness and the fact that it's in such good condition and that it has survived, given the amount of silver that is clearly in it, nearly 2 kilograms of silver. The reason it has survived is the second main reason we felt it was so compelling to buy. And that is, of course, its association with Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, I think one of Scotland's most notable, famous historical figures, and a casket so closely associated with her. I think the most appropriate place for such a piece, an iconic piece of national heritage, is within the national collection readily viewable freely within the museum. So we are extremely excited, happy to be able to acquire this object and now let everyone see it for themselves. Why do we think it's associated with Mary? The reason is this little provenance note that you can see on the screen before you. It was written between about 1680 and the very early 1700s by David Crawford, who was secretary to Anne, Duchess of Hamilton. And what it says is that this casket was acquired by the Duchess Anne from the estate of her mother-in-law, the Marchioness of Douglas, who had bought it, it says, from a papist, that is a Catholic. Now, the Marchioness of Douglas, this particular one, was known for her Catholic faith, and it's entirely likely that she would have been operating within such a Catholic network. The Marchioness of Douglas's oldest son William married Anne, Duchess of Hamilton, in her own right. And at this note says at the Duke's request that the Duchess had the arms of the Marchioness of Douglas that had been there before, you can see where they were on the screen, replaced by those of the Hamiltons with the Burling galley. It says in the note that these arms, replacing the Douglases, replaced an earlier inscribed set of arms relating to Mary. This is what the note says. The note also says that this is the casket that is said to have carried the letters between Mary and Lord Bothwell. So what we have here is an oral history being recorded for posterity and has been kept incredibly carefully in the box since then, ensuring that people would understand the significance of its provenance and previous ownership. The third reason is where the casket perhaps demonstrates Mary at the height of her powers, said to have been given to her by the Dauphin Francois, betrothed to him, and briefly Queen of France too. It suggests that very grand Renaissance figure. What it also as compellingly communicates is its part in the dramatic downfall of Mary. When this casket is said, as it says in the note, was produced at Westminster by Mary's half-brother, James Earl of Murray, containing the letters he produces, which involve her, make her complicit in the murder of a second husband, Lord Darnley, and in an illicit relationship with Lord Bothwell. Well, be that as it may, false or true, this is the history recorded in this particular note. So it's an incredibly important piece of rare French silver. It's an artwork in its own right. It's associated with one of our most major historical figures. And thirdly, this compelling part it played in the dramatic story of her downfall. It came into the museum and onto display in May. And currently it's in the big Hawthornden Court, which sits just on the edge of the Scotland galleries. And what we're using it to do is to really reframe the way we're presenting Mary in the galleries. So as I've suggested already, we've changed those two case displays to emphasize, using this same Clouet portrait, to emphasize Mary as she was in the moment without the full knowledge of her disastrous ending. So there she is, resplendent in pink and swathed in jewels. And the casket itself speaks to that majestic, magnificent Mary, reframing our presentation of her from the late 1550s into the early 1560s, from miserable to magnificent. So this is the where it will come into the display in December, and it will be displayed alongside the two cases on the right containing items belonging or associated with Mary, and on the left the exquisite Fettercan jewel, which is not associated with Mary, but it is typical of the sort of things that elite Scottish people were using in the 16th century. But moving on, where does that take us in the future? Well, we've already begun to do this in beginning to think about how we might display our Marian objects, in particular the casket, but also the jewelry, in the future. And one of those is that I'm very keen that we begin to embrace the creative responses to Mary that proliferate in popular culture in particular. This has led, and very exciting it was too, to us acquiring the theatrical crown for the title role of the Scottish Ballet's first inaugural commission, Mary Queen of Scots ballet, worn by the ballerina Elaine MacDonald in the theatre in Glasgow in 1976. And it's a rather wonderful, it's quite tall, it's maybe 1.5 feet tall, rather wonky, and you sort of imagine her having this on her head. And you can see on the left of the screen her wearing it in performance in an encounter with her nemesis, of course, Elizabeth I. And I'm very keen that we do this kind of thing because I think it continues to show just how prevalent Mary is within the popular consciousness. And I think the fact that a national ballet chose her as a subject for their first commission back in the 70s speaks volumes for Mary's continuing significance. So that was the first bit of collecting that I did in direct response to thinking about this Mary and how prevalent she is in the popular imagination. And since then, we've gone on here to collect a wonderful print by Willie Roger in 1975 for a set of historical figures of playing cards. We also own a set of the playing cards too. Where might we go with this in the future? Well, I think into areas perhaps that we might not necessarily previously have collected, including more less art type things into more commercialized perhaps figures. Here, a porcelain figure I'm looking at from the Royal Doylton Queens of the Realm series in 1988. So this is the type of thing that in the end, I would envisage us being able to show alongside Mary, that what we're doing is trying to grasp the multiple Marys that now exist in the 21st century. Mary means different things to different people in different ages and in different circumstances. Mary, the Catholic martyr, the innocent victim of a patriarchal society, the scheming temptress and complicit in the murder of her husband. Alternatively, the Mary brought up in the sophisticated Renaissance court, networked into two powerful European dynasties. So all of these different Marys that exist, as well as the tragic figure, Lichtenberg, who was executed. In the 21st century, Mary of the multiple plays and films, whereby most young people probably have encountered her, first perhaps in the Netflix series of Brain and rather more than in the pages of a history book. So going forward, our displays and the collecting that goes into them need to reflect those multiple Marys as we engage with new audiences by showing how Mary is still relevant today. Thank you.